Southeast, in Asia, in East Asia in the survey, as the country where the most people, and the most share of people who join organizations join political parties. In Indonesia, they join religious organizations. In Malaysia, it's political parties. But what's interesting, compared from 2006 to 2011, people are not joining political parties to the same degree. And in fact, now what is that? Well, some people have torn up their membership for some parties, right? And others don't really need to join the other parties because they can see that on the web, and it doesn't matter to them that they don't have to be a joiner to the same degree. And so you actually are seeing shifts in the actual engagement in a more traditional way of mass-based politics, and that is so you see these changes from 30% to 25%. But that said, and this is I think really quite exciting, is that women are actually joining politics in a much more different way, in a much more active way. And that is they're joining in local politics in really high numbers. And I should have put you the numbers here, but we ask questions like residential associations, are you part of environmental groups, social groups, and society groups, right? In fact, what you're seeing is that, and even parts of social movement aspects, like environment groups like Per Se and others, right? We find that women are joining politics at the local level, or through these different social networks at a much higher level. So we're seeing what we find in political science generally in the study of women's political participation, and that is women tend to focus on politics at the local level as opposed to the national level. And now as the system has opened up and become more pluralistic, and there's been more expansion of civil society, we're seeing women joining politics at a much higher level in these groups at the local levels. And I think this is, to me, very interesting. But it also is shaping the way women are engaging. So for example, down the line, when local elections become something that is actually a reality across the country, I would project that you will have a high level of women participation at these areas because women are actually very locally rooted in these civil society and residential society organizations as opposed to joining the parties at the national level. And I think one of the things the reasons I advocate for local elections is that I actually think you'll bring a lot more women into politics because of that type of connection. Now, here is another key point in the discussion that I'd like to highlight, and that is, what do we see in terms of the support for Barisan Nasional versus Pakatan? The general point to make here is that we have quite a marked, what we call gender gap in terms of support. So it goes from 5 to 8% at a macro level, and it can go, it's even at sometimes gone beyond 10%. And the general trend is the following. Women are more likely to vote for the incumbent government and support the incumbent government than men. By something that we call, from perspective of surveys, as statistically significant. And some of the women are looking at themselves and saying, really? Not the women I know. But what, or some other people would say yes, so maybe, or in that context. And I think one has to go back to what I said in the very beginning of the discussion, is that we need to talk about which women, right? We need to recognize the diversity of women to understand why we would be able to see this type of gender gap. The first thing to note is that the data is ethnicized along the gender gap. Among Chinese women, there is no gender gap. Men and women have the same levels of support for Pakatan versus BN, which, by the way, right now is not so good for BN side, on the Chinese side. But in terms of the Malay and Indian vote, you actually see the gender divide reaching, clearly above 5%, above 5 to 10%, right? Sometimes as big as 10%. And I'll come back to this a little bit later, because when we look at the tactics that's being used politically, actually by the Barisan, is that they're being effective towards women. And I'll come to that in a little bit later, and why. Okay? But I also would say that it's also about place. All right? Geography also affects some of these data in interesting ways. And that is, we find that in rural areas, you have a much bigger gender gap. And while, for example, disproportionately we find in more rural and semi-rural areas that women tend to be, men and women tend to have higher levels of support for Fabarsan, depending on where you are, and Kelantan versus Johor and Pahang are very different type of states that are rural, and one has to distinguish also between its state levels too. I'm willing to do that in discussions later, but what we see here is that it's as much as 15%. Yes, it is so much, which is telling you something. Okay? It's telling you something about how parties are operating in the rural areas. Let me give you an observation that I have from the field. Let's say you're picking a seat in Pahang. Let's pick a seat, Timor, for example, as a hypothetical one. Now, you have a situation where you have rural PAS, although that seat may go in a slightly different direction in who gets chosen how. But let's say it's an UMNO versus PAS dynamic. Okay? In those circumstances, why would it be that there would be such a sharp divide? Well, part of what happens is that of the two parties in the rural areas, UMNO has the most outreach outside of their community, their set of friends. One of the things that I find about PAS in the rural areas is that they stick to themselves. And there's not outreach. So they reinforce the base that they have as opposed to extending the base in particular ways. And we see that because everyone in the rural areas knows everyone else. They all say things, they see one person as maybe less holy than compared to another person, and there's these differences, as we know, in different communities. And so crossing and bridging capital in these areas and coming out of those things becomes harder, and those divisions become sharper. Right? But it also has to do with the fact that you still have the social relationships, and still have some of the machinery that I was pointing to earlier. A second area where we have, as a point of reference, is that sometimes in some urban areas you don't see much of a gender gap as much, right? It depends, it depends on what area you're looking at in these areas. So it's that statistically is not as statistically significant. East Malaysia also has big gender gaps, which goes to the point that I was mentioning earlier. Rural contestation. Now, the problem with East Malaysia is that the survey data that we've done there we've oversampled to be able to, but we don't capture enough of the diversity to be able to look specifically at some of the differences. But we can broadly see differences across the major ethnicities, like Iban, like Kenasans, and other areas. But we see this across communities because it reflects some of these parallels. And in fact, in East Malaysia, there's also much more conservative values among women. There's more. Some of the other attitudes that I mentioned earlier are actually. It's more than that case in Sarawak. Sabah is interesting enough in terms of political attitudes. It's the most liberal state in the country, which I always find very interesting when we look at the measurements of these areas. But if you go to Sabah, you probably know why.
The most liberal state, is it?
In many ways, yes. So as a state, I kind of like it. They like the state. All right, now I'm going to get into things that I hope I'm not going to offend people. I'm sure I've already done that, so I apologize in advance. I want to talk about what are the manifestos of the different parties and campaigns, and what does that mean in terms of some of the questions that have come up from the perspective of the campaign so far. Right? So you've seen, we've actually, for the Pakatan initiative, has actually got some fascinating ideas that have actually, I think, are very innovative and are actually pioneering from the perspective of women's issues in the context of Malaysia. Child care, the retirement fund, which I think focuses on housewives, not single mothers and single people, but it looks at the consolidation of microfinancing. It has training components. These are some of the key elements that are there, and then they profess, at least at this level, towards working towards a target of 30%. But the question on the ground so far of what I've done in terms of some focus groups and discussions is that a lot of women they don't understand there's a bit too much complexity in what these things are, right? And there's not a lot of trust towards Pakatan from the perspective of the potential to implement this, especially the household fund. Okay? And there have been some criticisms raised that they're looking at issues of women predominantly through the lens a housewife and a traditional family unit, as opposed to recognizing some of the differences in the way the family unit structure is there. And it's seen as, some people will say, it's a conservative approach to looking at these questions. So these are some of the things that have come up associated with the discussions of the manifesto so far. But I think the biggest lesson that I could say is that most women don't have a clue what the manifesto is. And that in fact there has been a lack of communication with women about women at a general level from what we've been able to assess from at least my initial assess at this particular juncture. And again, I provoke and hope I provoke some reactions. Now, we have yet to get the BN's manifesto, although the indications are that, and I'm looking forward to reading it in other areas, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the BN's campaign, because the BN's campaign has been going on for 4 years now, and I think we can actually see the way that the pattern has emerged. And I think the big point I'm trying to suggest, and I think I alluded to it earlier, is that BRIM has had a big impact on women compared to men. And why is that? Well, the reason for that is that this money has actually disproportionately, when we look at the distribution pattern, been collected by women more than men. And in fact, because of the standards and some of the criteria, and also that money has gone into the immediate funds for women to buy consumables. And some of the other things that are part of the goodies that have been given out. So, for example, about 2 weeks ago, I was at Kudakunya, where professors sometimes go to buy books and to look and to check out what's happening. And for the first time in my many, many years of being in Kudakunya, there was a long line. Couldn't figure out why there was a long line in Kudakunya, right? You never have a line in Kudakunya, right? It was because of the school books vouchers, right? And everyone was in there because of the school book vouchers, right? And of course there was taking pictures, I was interviewing, doing focus groups, and it was affecting the things as we all, will you vote for BN? Will you vote for Pakatan? Why with this? And this type of situation. It was fascinating to listen to the women and their responses in the line. Always has to be a political scientist when we look at these things. But why, beyond that, is that it is focused on the issues of basic needs, and it's often gone immediately into the household funds. And women are on the front line of the management of finances, especially those that are actually very vulnerable. And as a tactic politically, what we're seeing is you hear the responses repeatedly by women in the system. Well, they're helping us. This is the most money I've ever gotten from the government. This is the most I've ever gotten from the government, which, by the way, is a really sad answer. But irrespective, right? But we can see this particular element that is there. And there is also a sense, however, is that the BN generally, they have not had a clear set of prior promises. And I think if we, and I would appreciate other comments in the room, because this is something you all study and you're on the front line and your own experiences, but the Najib's administration on women's issues has been checkered. That's my diplomatic response. And that we actually have a male women's minister.
It's a blank page.
Yes, and I think that what we don't have is there is nothing beyond a clear set of priorities beyond this money. And in fact, from what I can tell, in terms of the manifesto, right, that there has been very limited impact by women, for women, within the BN side on the issues of women. And that the manifesto seems to be focused on kind of macro issues, leaving women out of the equation. And I think this is something down the line that I think is going to be very interesting in the campaign. I think this is stopped, by the way, so that's all right. Now, so let's turn to, I have just one I want to talk about a few other issues from a gender perspective, and I think that
all I can say is bring it on.
much.
As you can tell, I've got the pictures and other things that are here, but
Just to wake us up.
I noticed it provoked a very strong
Immediately
reaction.
the
And by the way,
response.
she does provoke a strong reaction in the campaigns as well,
Everywhere,
which I
yeah.
think is important. But I do want to point out that what's so far, right? Maybe education has been in the campaign, but health has not been in the campaign. Cost of living issues are there, right? But a lot of the gender issues are actually, they're there, but they're not center stage in the campaign so far. And of course, obviously, the official campaign hasn't started, right? So I think, from my perspective, and again, I would appreciate your reaction here, gender issues are not center stage in this campaign, right? And women's issues are not center stage. But I would actually suggest to you, and I know a lot of you will maybe disagree with me, but the gender factor is very pronounced. Earlier today, Clive was commenting about the Rafida remarks and about the boyfriend versus the abusive husband and all of these other things that came up. We actually see a lot of attacks on women in this campaign. And I picked Rosma as an example because, for good or for bad, whatever your views of this, as you step back as an analyst, as I look at this, the attacks on women are quite common. And it's not a coincidence that the two, I find it a little bit of a concern, right? That the two groups, if we look at the two biggest scandals from UMNO, they've involved women, Rosma and Shahrazad. And I would say disproportionately, the amount of scandals that do exist are much more than the two women. But they're not getting attention to the same way that the women's issues are getting. And you also see a lot of attacks on women candidates, and specifically focusing on specific women candidates, such as Nurul-Izzah, to remove her from power, for example, as a sample of the seats, right? So you actually see this particular area is quite focused. And I think, for me, what I've studied is that generally in Malaysia, for example, like the squatting incident involving Teresa Kok in the 1999 campaign, when you go after a woman, it backfires politically, right? And in fact, we see that pattern, right? But what is happening in this campaign is that women's attacks on women are actually only leading to more attacks on women. From a perspective of personal character areas. Right? And I think that the interesting thing here to say is that this campaign is truly the dirtiest campaign in election history because of the scope and the broadening of the way that the dirty campaigns are asked. And this is not to say there are personal attacks on men, right? But to say, for example, to have the illusion of a sex video on a woman, right, is, I think, an indication of really crossing some gender lines that have not been crossed before in these areas, which I think are and so the other aspect of the gender in the campaign that I think is important is that, and I turn to the issues of reject political violence discussion here, I think you can't see this if you're streaming here, but I think there is an unease among a lot of the electorate about the issues of intimidation, the potential of violence, and this disproportionately affects women compared to men. Obviously, it affects everyone, but I would say that women get a bit more anxious when you have high levels of intimidation or threat. They may not, and we don't know what the impact that's going to have on the vote. So, and what people wanting to come out if there are these types of issues in the campaign. I want to be careful not to prejudge things, but I want to point this out. I realized I've talked for a long time. I'm very sorry. Let me just finish up for a few more points here. I thought this was only a 20-minute presentation, and I was wrong. But let me just go to I have just two more slides, and I apologize here. I wanted to point out to some of the patterns that I think are important. I feel that there will not be a significant increase in the number of women candidates slated to this discussion. I think what we're going to see is a continuation of a gradual trend that we've seen in the last few years. But I want to point out that the pattern of representation is actually shifting. I have to put the parliament levels here, right? What we're seeing is a very disturbing pattern in UMNO, in that they're decreasing their number of women candidates. So what we saw in 2009 was 11, right? In 2008, it was only 8, right? Yes, that was right, 8, right? So, or 9, one of the two, but I think it was 8. So it was actually at the parliamentary level. And you know, all of us who study women's politics and the politics of Malaysia know that UMNO is the party that empowered women to become candidates from the very beginning. And that actually you saw elements of that, not in the other political parties. And so when UMNO starts to, because it's so many of the seats, when it starts to reduce the number of women candidates, the implication is such that this actually has an impact. And what's happening also is the caliber of the candidates is also decreasing. And the scandals associated with women candidates, at least in UMNO, are also increasing. So potential candidates that are fielded are actually don't fall into the same rubric of the comparative advantage of women candidates, which are seen as more hardworking, they're cleaner, they're less corrupt. We're now seeing women that are potentially are seen as corrupt, potentially being fielded, with having questions around them, which of course makes differences as less sharp than they were in the past. We're also seeing an increase in the number of women that PAS is fielding. And what what we're finding is that PAS may field up to 24 women in this next election. But one considers this from 1999, where to be able to field one to this context, this is actually a very big change. So the numbers are not necessarily reflecting the changes inside. Where I expect changes this time around, I also expect MCA and MIC to reduce their candidates of women outside because of the more competitiveness of their seats. There's lots of internal wrangling. And I think what's particularly disturbing for me is that you're actually starting to see less Indian women participating in politics and giving seats. And I think this is true, by the way, in this formal politics than other areas. We're seeing more trends also of women being fielded in Sabah and Sarawak, which is a change of positive growth of women in terms of numbers there. So we're seeing some shifts that I think are very interesting. But I think it is important to recognize that these targets of 30% and others are unlikely to be met. Now, what is the reason for that? I always ask the political parties, how come you're not slating more women? And then the answers are, well, we don't have qualified candidates. And I said, well, did you look? Did you look? And it's not, sorry to be insulting and anything, but I think, did you ask? Did you connect? And I think part of it is that because the politics has become so dirty, and it's become something that is actually, that's contestation, that is actually not bringing women in to the same degree. And many of the parties talk about having to really convince women to want to take these types of positions compared to the past. And I'm sure there are others in the room that can speak to these things better than I can. So let me just close now, and I apologize for speaking for too long here, but I think that we're seeing changing patterns in the representation of women. A lot more women professionals coming in, a lot of actually different classes of women also participating. We're seeing more involvement in politics at the local levels and engaging. And so I think women are playing an important role in Malaysian politics as you move to the GE and as this process evolves. And for me, when I talk about the GE, for me, I recognize that GE is a process of a change that Malaysia is going to continue to grow even after the election. And it's just it's not the be and end all of politics. Politics is multifaceted and there's many different streams of what's happening and the changes taking place. So far for me, the GE 13 is not yet a women's election. There may be issues that come up in the campaign that we cannot actually say. But what I would say is that I think the ultimate results of the election will be determined by women, and I'll close there.
Thank you very much. Shall we take questions? Maybe we take 3 questions and then we can answer.
I can have a pen, but I can just write them down so I don't forget.
Yes. First 3 questions.
Doctor, just to get your immediate reaction, the PM just announced in their manifesto that if they win, they'll increase BRIM from 500 to 1,200 ringgit, and for individuals, it will be up to 600 ringgit, up from 200 ringgit. So, what will the impact be on criminal voters?
You want to?
I'll take a few questions.
Take the
Yeah.
questions.
More a comment, but it's interesting you say this. The idea that you say that women don't trust the judiciary. I just did a double check on the judiciary website, and out of 85 judges and judicial commissioners at a high court level, 47 are men, 38 are women. It's almost half. And yet, you have this very interesting, and I reckon actually at the lower level, the subordinate court level, you probably get a higher representation of women as magistrates and presidents of subordinate courts. So it's interesting how you get a survey which sees or doesn't identify doesn't trust the judiciary. It's quite interesting.
I wonder what they have in mind at judiciary when you want the Sharia court.
I think that's my answer to that. I think
That's probably my only explanation.
I think it includes the Sharia from what I can assess, because we just ask the courts, so it's not doesn't specify in that particular way. Although we do ask about the independence of the judiciary, so that in the other sense of
I just want a clarification on, you said in the rural areas, the women tend to be almost 50% more, tend to support or just support the ruling government.
It depends on which rural areas.
Incumbent means,
No.
I want a clarification. Who are they supporting more? And also your link to that about how UMNO Wanita or UMNO has missionary that reaches out to people outside, whereas PAS is a bit more closed. Can I have an elaboration of that, more clarification of that? Because I thought PAS was also very wide in its outreach. The women, I mean, the
And
women.
then we take the next.
So the first question is, I think that, the survey's data shows that the BRIM is having a diminishing effect, and that the first BRIM was much more impactful in changing voting patterns than the second BRIM. So I think that you're going to see diminishing returns on the BRIM as a general point of view, but I think there's also concerns that this is actually, a recognition that this may be too much. And so I think, and you have to factor in the issue of trust. Women and men want to see the money first. and also at the same time, I think that money is only an element that is actually determining the outcome. We're going to wait and see how the other campaign shapes. And I think why I mentioned the BRIM is the only key element, predominant key element so far, is that the campaign really, as a campaign, has yet to start, right? So we're going to see how that might shift things. And I think women will probably be spending more time looking at the campaign than they were before. And so I think it's too early to project that this is going to be decisive. Oops, what happened? iPhone?
No.
Okay, you're right.
I'm okay.
Oh, is it okay?
What was the reactions of the women who were at Kinokuniya? Yesterday were asking people how they felt about.
Well, they were mixed. Right? They were all very grateful for the school books. And I think, but I think the fact is that you do get in the urban areas less impact of money to affect your vote, right? Than you do in the assessments that I do in the rural areas. Rural areas and East Malaysia, it's important. Now let me go to the question that you asked. I answered the question. I think it has to do with the Sharia laws. But I also think that it's not just about the issues of judges. One has to look more holistically about the access to legal representation. Well, women don't feel that they have the same access than men. So it's not just about the judges and who are the judges. It's about how they engage the law and how the law engages them. And I think there are also certain provisions that I think women don't feel that there's a sense of protection. AKA, for example, that have to do with particular Sharia issues like alimony, divorce, things along those lines. And this factors into the things I mentioned earlier about social problems. And I think, I think it would be interesting to do a better study. We just have some markers of this. And by the way, I didn't say this in the presentation, but from 2006 to 2011, the level of trust by women of the judiciary increased. And I think it's also interesting to note that between 2006 and 2011, there was an increase in women judges appointments. And in fact, it was a significant increase in change in the judiciary. So I do think, as you point out, that is something that can impact the process. And I think the more women judges there are, the better in some areas. But that's not just in some areas for this particular thing. I want to answer the last question here, and I'll get to you in a moment, and people can react. I'm sorry. That is to clarify, Ivy, your question. First of all, I'm giving a bit of a sweeping thing when I say rural areas, because one has to distinguish between rural areas in Sabah and Sarawak and rural areas in Kelantan and Terengganu and other things along those lines. Right? One also has to distinguish the fact you have to recognize that the definition of what is rural is changing massively in Malaysia. So many of these areas are actually semi-rural. So, for example, Guamusang, right, is now which is considered to be a very rural area, right, actually has semi-rural parts inside of it, the town and other things. So it's actually, it's not, you have to start to go looking more carefully at that in these areas. And we have a scale that we look at in this regard. Now, generally, the way the survey data is looked at is it basically uses census marks to distinguish some of this. And I think it doesn't capture some of those nuances. But generally what we're seeing, as taken as a whole, it can be up to 15% is a difference in gap. So it's not necessarily always 15%. It's not 50%, it's 15%. Okay. But I was trying to also try to explain why there might be these consolidated positions. Right? We have different patterns in different states. In Kelantan, you have families and groups of families that are divided by political orientation. Okay? And the same thing, by the way, in Terengganu, where I have my adopted Malay, one of my adopted Malay families are actually, have these patterns. But what we're seeing in the context of campaigning, right, is that PAS as a party has a hard time extending into, especially women, extending into other areas. While UMNO, because it's more fluid, and it is actually more able to bridge some of the differences, to capture some of the more undecided voters. From what we can tell, at least it depends by state. It differs in Kelantan and it differs in Pahang. But my only point to emphasize is that I have found, in particular, a lot of PAS women are unwilling to reach out to other elements, other members of the community that they think are less moral than they are, or not practicing good moral practices in this particular area. And you find that at the rural area, not as compared to more pronounced. I think I've answered those three sets of questions. I think that this young lady had a question.
I was wondering about this trust or lack of trust in the judiciary. Which groups of women feel this way? And secondly, which judiciary, is it the Sharia court or is it the civil courts? Because a lot of women don't deal with judiciary necessarily.
Unless it's family court.
So there must be certain categories of women that find themselves having to go to court or having to face judiciary. I just have one more question. I'll throw that in as well. And that is to do, I'm wondering, I think you could answer that, whether BRIM and giving out of benefits really makes a big difference, or people laughing and taking the money. Because I talk a lot to taxi drivers. I find myself in taxis quite a lot. And the taxi drivers are laughing about the tires. They've been given vouchers for...
Some of them are crying about the tires, yeah.
And they are very clear that this is... one taxi driver actually said this is like throwing a biscuit to the dog, he said. Whereas there are other things long-term that they have wanted. They have wanted their own personal license. They have wanted SOXO. Otherwise, when there's an accident, they have to deal with it themselves. and a couple of other things which they've been asking for have never been listened to, and suddenly these 2 tires, four tires.
More lah.
But not good quality tires, that's the thing they're complaining about.
They've taken the tires. This is showing the voucher. It's important. But they're not convinced that this is a good government, nevertheless. Practically every taxi driver that I spoke to. So I'm wondering whether Malaysians really that gullible, they're naive, they just suddenly think that this is good government descended on them, giving them basically rollouts.
So, I think, yes, one more question.
You said about the survey finding Malaysians getting to be more liberal. What were the issues that measure that? And the other one is the changing political scene and the decline of wanita UMNOs. I think that's really very interesting because, certainly when I was covering politics in the 1980s, I mean, the ability of wanita UMNO to reach out. And the kumpulan 5, kumpulan 10, the much about, kumpulan 5, is that like, are they no longer involved in that because of the involvement? Like, so is UMNO as a party at the divisional and branch level not mobilizing the women anymore to go out, and get the votes?
Okay, let me start. I have 6 already. Yeah, they get many. You won't have to. No, but this gentleman has been in the corner.
One of the slides, you talk about gender gap in terms of support.
Yes.
You mentioned about 5 to 8%, is Malaysia 12%. I wonder whether you have data to tell which is more significant, location, culture, class, or gender. In terms of support gap in this coming election.
Okay, good questions. Let me begin by saying that most of them I can't answer. All right. The first set of questions has to do with the judiciary, which groups of women, which sets of questions about this. I think this is a great survey project. If you can give me some money, I'll try to get it done. I think that this is something that is actually really important to look at from a perspective of trying to assess why and how.
Why do they go to the court? What are their issues?
But your survey was
What are they
My
doing?
survey, see, basically, we only have a few questions in the survey of 220 things, 20 questions, and we do it every 5 years. And we were able to, it costs a lot of money to do this survey because it's all done through face-to-face interviews in multiple sets of languages. It takes 2 months for us to do, it's not just one of those phone surveys, and then we have lots of checking because we want to maintain the standards in this process. So, but I think I can't give you good answers here, right? And I haven't really run the numbers about looking at ethnicity and other factors. That's something I can do after the elections and maybe in June or July when I'm trying
Is
to
it
cover.
proportionate?
But I'll see if I can do that, and I'm happy to share with Maria and share with you. But I haven't looked specifically at that other element.
Is the ethnic component proportionate?
Yeah. We also oversample in East Malaysia to capture some of the differences, but we don't capture enough, which is why I said the ethnicity factors are there. Now, I forgot to mention something, and your question engendered a question for me. The other institution that women have less trust in is the police. And I forgot to, but it's not I forgot to mention that. The police gets the lowest trust out of most of the institutions. By the way, the military, just because I'm being balanced, gets the most trust in that context. And the royalty also gets very high levels of trust. I'm telling you what the answers of the survey tell me. Whether or not they're accurate or not, is that. But I'm sharing you with what we find, which can be a question, right? But it varies by state. But I think that it's important to point that out. I forgot to mention that. Okay, so the impact of BRIM, a good question. I think that in the urban areas, BRIM will not have an effect, except for those at the lower classes, among certain groups, and among particularly, I think, Indians and Malays. This is, but I actually think it's going to be less than people realize. And I think the reason I say this is because we can just look at the polling data of first BRIM versus second BRIM and see that the level of support for Najib and for Barisan has not gone up to the same degree. The impact, the BRIM effect, is not that significant as from a perspective of statistical answers. Now, but the rural areas is a little bit harder to assess, okay? And the reason for that is because we don't, for many parts of these rural areas, the only time their government comes to see them is during elections. And we know that the money politics is powerful in Sarawak, and it is powerful in Sarawak. And there are other aspects that reinforce it. You see, it's not just about the money per se, it's about the context of where that money is being played. And you see, and this is something for me quite important. For many of these people who live in these rural areas who have had, for the first time, schools, first time roads, the money is symbolic of what they see as a change in their lifetime in terms of development. And it's only the second generation. So for example, what's happening in Sabah now? We can talk about the Sabahan movement, the Borneo movement, the changes of ethnicity, the political awakening. But what is actually one element that is happening in Sabah, for me, is that the context of development is shifted. What they're seeing is that the gains in the real quality of life is actually not as high as it was a few years back. And so you see, and so there is not that same impact, especially among younger generation. Sabahans who feel that there's not that big imprint of the new road, that new bridge, that new school, that new clinic that changed some other people's lives. So it's not the money per se, the 500 or the 1500 ringgit or whatever it is. It's the context of that, and that's what becomes difficult for us to assess how meaningful it is. And I think it's also what has to recognize is that the opposition is not reaching the rural areas. So there is no alternative sets of messaging that is actually that is happening in these areas. And this is, despite Radio Free Sarawak or other things like that. I'm talking about real sort of disparities. But that said, and this is something I would people can also comment. One of the things that I think is very important to recognize is that there's a tendency, especially in urban areas, to say, oh, these voters are so stupid, that they're being fooled. In fact, they're not stupid. They're very clever. They're making their decisions based on what their choices are and how they're maximizing their interests. It may not be just your sense of interests. And you see, and how it influences, we don't know. But I think we do see, at least from what we can look at, and polling is, by the way, it's a very imperfect science, right? And in the context of Malaysia, we have to recognize some of the shortcomings of all of this. And I'm the first person from a methodological point of view to recognize some of the issues. What I find are important is to look at trends to help us try to understand it. But we have to look at the polling data in the context of how it might be interpreted, right? And the reasons, but it's not just BRIM per se, it's for example, what the money means in that context of that particular area, right? Now, let's go to the questions of liberal thing. Well, it's complicated. I use a series of things, right? I look at religiosity. I look at what I call social traditionalism, which is basically attitudes towards society, towards teachers, towards parents. I look at what is known as political traditionalism. These are things that Reinhardt and others have looked at in terms of conservative values, or what they call traditional values. So, for example, do you believe in hierarchy? Do you believe that, should you always listen to your teacher? Should you always listen to these types of areas? Then we have looked at individualism versus collective type of responses. Then I have a component that looks at issues of conflict. And then I have questions about democracy. Do you support democracy? How much do you assess democracy? How much do you have checks and balances? Right? How much do you, one component is political tolerance. So how do you feel these issues about these? We asked about specific groups. For example, we asked not in this survey, but the previous survey, for example, for issues about apostasy, issues about homosexuality, things along. So we look at these kind of issues of tolerance. So it's a combined set of things, and I only pointed out to the one area that is different. But in terms of supporting and engaging in politics and supporting democratic processes, the trend is positive. Overall, from 2006 to 2011, from the survey data that I've analyzed. But there are differences, and there are pockets of difference, and one area involves religion. And so we asked questions about whether or not you should have secular government versus other areas, and the answers support what we've seen for other surveys, which is no in that context. So it's it's different, and it varies by groups and others. So now the next question had to do with the leadership of UMNO Wanita. I think, actually I answered the question. You asked me what about the fate of it. I think a lot of it has to do with there's poor leadership. And that leadership has been discredited, and that leadership, and there is a clear replacement of that. Right? And for good or for bad, whatever you think of Rafida, she was a good leader of that organization. From the perspective of mobilizing people, bringing in new blood, energizing that. I mean, I think she did. She could have done things better, and I think I'm not saying that there weren't imperfections, but I would say as we look at organizations and compare it from maybe the youth branch and other branches, Wanita UMNO worked reasonably well. It is actually not working as well.
So like kumpulan 5, kumpulan 10, is that not functioning?
They do, but they're actually using more modern techniques for data, right? You see, the whole campaign mechanism is changing. So it's now it's computerized. They have geographic information systems that they know where people are living, right? So they don't even rely on that local network as for information. It's much more it's much more technical, right? So
is it more accurate?
Well, I will see.
Because, I remember when, like going to the kampungs and talking with the poor, it's amazing how they work. They, because the women are out there in the field and they watch who, they know, who that shopkeeper is going to vote for. They watch who goes. The opposition goes there, the next day, they are there to talk again and to sense whether that person has changed his mind or not in terms of which. They're like amazing how they were able, and this is actually that kind of outreach and willingness that the Wanita UMNO were willing to do that the past women were not willing. You're not going to talk to the man, he's a Chinese, this was the 1980s, and I was just like really amazed, at their operations.
But you see, but that's my point to say is that Wanita UMNO, I think, was the strength of UMNO as a word, and from a perspective of the campaigning, all right? My point is that it's changing, all right? And how much of changing, more studies need to be done, all right? But I am seeing a change, and I point that out. So I have the last question, which has to do with the gender gap question about how do you weigh location, class, gender, and ethnicity, and I'm sorry to say I can't answer that.
Do we have data on that?
Well, we have data, yeah, but the problem is it depends on how you run your statistical analysis
because
of
your
the
last
model.
conclusion is based on the gender gap. The election is lost as based.
Well, I say
because the last election was won by 4 or 5% margin. So, and your gender gap is also not unique. You're talking East Malaysia, 12%.
But you see, you got to understand one thing about polling, and I think other people have written this. Because Malaysia has a system of malapportionment, statistical data that basically looks at what are national trends do not necessarily map clearly onto the electoral terrain. Because the electoral terrain is not based on a one person, one vote framework, right? So that's where you have to look at place and position and other things to recognize the impact of that. And some of these things are cross-cutting right? So it's not so simple to answer these things. As I was just answering to Ivy just now, the issues of rural questions, I was pointing out, well, it depends by state, right, in this context. So,
Do you have comprehensive enough data to do slides and dice of those areas?
so I have some. I think Merdeka Center and other polling outfits have more, right? And they can do more of this than I have. I mean, I took a lens today that I thought was useful for this presentation to basically let people see where this is happening. But I haven't done it, and I did a bit of intersectionality from ethnicity and from class, but I didn't look at the three, I actually didn't look at class, because we also have a problem with class numbers, because class numbers are based on income, but the problem is that the income measures are at the individual level as opposed to household income, so it becomes harder to make assessments.
The gender and
Wait,
the class.
Josh, sorry, can you hold your question? Mas has got a question.
Just now when you mentioned that corruption ranks quite low for women when it comes to issues that they're concerned about.
Except for the ring.
Sorry, except for the ring.
Very good.
Is there a difference? Do you only poll for men, women, and how they look at it, or is there already also an age group segregation among the sexes to see? Because I would think that younger women will probably be more concerned about corruption as opposed to say older. That's one. Two, I think the mudslinging, quote unquote, the ring, all the women who have been, all the women leaders who have been discredited. In some ways, it's much easier to grasp the corruption level because you're talking about rings and shopping bills and children and houses, apartments, etc. Whereas the corruption for men would be a bit more complex. I mean, look at Tai Mahmud's case. It's a bit harder and a lot more sophisticated in terms of where the money is parked, etc. That's point number two. Yeah, but it's not like
Submarines, that kind of thing.
how much does Rosemar spend on a shopping spree in one place? I mean, that's like so arresting. People can really identify with that. So in that sense, the focus for that is much easier to capture people's imagination. The other one is you talk about manifesto and how the messaging is not so targeted towards women. Or is that how I understand it? Like, is there a difference between targeting women and targeting men for the manifesto? My last, very quickly, I'm from Center for Independent Journalism, and we're actually doing a media monitoring of coverage of the elections. And one of the issues that we're also looking at, there are various issues, not policy as well as non-policy. One of the issues that we're looking at is also gender. So we're also looking at things like sexuality, women in politics, personal private life, women's issues, LGBTIQ, women's appearance, sexism, others. We're also flagging photos, etc. for further study. We're doing this to look whether it's positive, negative, whether it's neutral in terms of the coverage, and also to see where there is attacking or attack. We are also coding for that. Apart from that, we're also coding for things like when women candidates are mentioned, certain women candidates, and when women in general, box pop kind of thing, are also mentioned. So when women are mentioned, as well as when women are quoted as sources for quotes, for stories, etc. Yeah, just to share that.
I'm very much looking forward to that data. And the last part, so okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, thanks.
Just like to ask about you mentioned that there are less Indian women in politics. I just want to know what are the dynamics that are shaping them. Is it more of a race thing or is it more of a gender thing?
Just to press you a little bit more on Brim and what Levin was talking about, the promise of more money. From what I could take in from the presentation, rural women play a disproportional part in terms of the outcome of elections, and rural women are perhaps the ones that are attracted more to or benefit more from the fact that they can hand out from the government. Now, given that, wouldn't then that imply that if there is a promise of more money coming their way, that would lead them either to stay with support for the government or sway them to support the government because of the expectation that more of this is coming and they are at the front line of enjoying the benefit of all these things.
Okay, let me see if I can unpack some of these questions. Let me begin with Andrew's sets of questions here. You see, the problem with these types of analyses is that one has to recognize that there are going to be, in this election, many factors that will matter, right? I do believe women are going to be an important factor in this outcome. But it's not the only factor, right? There are going to be other factors that I believe are going to be as important. So for example, I believe that what's going to happen from the age between 20 and 30, what younger voters who have the disproportionately highest level of undecided among every age group, right? They are going to be important because they're the numbers. But why do all of these things matter? Because you're going to have close races. You're going to have very close races, right? And so I'm saying it is decisive, but other factors are going to be as decisive, right? And obviously I don't have enough time to go into all of the different factors that I think are going to be, but I'm trying to give you a few of the top ones that I think that are crucial, right? And I think when I've given presentations before, I've highlighted key sets of groups that I think are important. East Malaysians, youth, I think women, I think very important are what's going to happen in civil servants. Civil servants, and I've said this in other presentations, what's interesting about the civil service is that the civil service is a national group. And they're in all these different constituencies. And so you go to places like in Terengganu and in Permaisuri, and what do you have? You have a government agency. And you have people who are positioned there. And you have teachers that are positioned in these areas, and they are important figures. So what's happened in the civil servants is another going to be a decisive factor about what happens in that time. And it's not just Malay vote, it's civil service Malay vote. That are important. So I could give you a few of the other examples that I see of what I call the different layering of the different aspects that I think are important. And I think this goes to Josh's questions, where he's pushing me quite rightly, because those questions are about this overlapping differences, the overlapping sets of factors of place and others that are shaping the politics that in a very close type sense of race. Right? And that's why, in a sense, the politicians and the parties know this, because that's why they've been trying all these multiple campaignings, right, to all these different sets of groups, because they're all trying to see if they can get one group to go this way and one group to go that way in order for them to win the election, and hoping that these things will work in their directions. And the BRIM is one of the things that's on top of that, right? Because the BRIM targets almost 70% of the population, although it's the lowest 40%. It's a very holistic type of thing, but you have to couple it with other programs, which are actually we're talking about the most spending that's ever been in an election, Malaysian election, and it will be, and we're not even started yet. Yeah. We're really only looking at the election primer, but I believe, despite all of this, while money is important, I believe what's interesting about this election is the things of where money is not important. Okay? What is so interesting is that there are so many factors that are non-money oriented that are affecting why people are voting. Okay? And that's what makes this election so interesting from a point of view, but it also adds to the uncertainty of how this process of interpreting it. I'm one of those people that will say to you, anybody who gives you numbers is lying to you because they don't know. Nobody knows. Right? I can tell you, what I do consistently is tell you, if someone asks me, this is the set of seats that I think are going to be competitive. These are the seats that I see in this area, and those are the seats in the other area. And I've been to almost all the constituencies. And looking and assessing that. And that's all I can do, because we're going to see how those things play out. And polling can only be an indication. And the campaign momentum will happen. So I'm answering this by saying, I resist going to a very simplistic, linear type of discussion of saying this promise is going to lead to this type of impact, because there are cross-cutting factors that will affect that, right? And what I said earlier is I think it's a diminishing returns factor, right? And I think that the fact that it's no longer new. Right? And many people are seeing this as an act of desperation, right? And foolishness, right? From the perspective of, and they're saying, and we know, and from a development point of view, this type of cash transfers that has been so consistent. There's been no study, for example, looking at what if the brim has actually helped people from a real sense. So,
is that important?
Right? Actually, it is important from a perspective that it's taxpayer money. Okay, sorry, yeah. But I mean, the development budget has gone down. All these, I'm sorry, I've written. I'm sorry, I'm being too serious. No, it's good. It's a good question, and I should laugh and relieve a bit too much here. But yeah, so in that context, I would say that's why I'm speaking as that. Now, very good question about Indian issues. Right? You said, is it race? And you said, is it class? Is it gender? Right? And my answer is, it's neither. It's parties. And I think that it has to do with the representation of the political parties engaging Indian women, and I think the party that has to do the most with this is what's happening in MIC. There's high level infighting. You have positioning of the different players. Who's going to be in what seat? And MIC is facing challenges for their seats as a whole. Although I think they'll probably end up doing better than MCA does in terms of reduction of their seats. But in that context, what my feeling is that this has to do with the dynamic in the party. But I also think what we're seeing is that the tactics of engaging Indians since 2008 has been one about promoting division, splintering the community, dividing the community. Giving some monies to this group, giving money to that group. We see a lot more, and then in that context, women's voices are not being heard in this dynamic of division. Now, again, other people may have different views on this, but this is just an observation. So to me, it has less to do with gender and race. It has to do with politics and the way parties are engaging these communities in a particular way. Now we go to the question of messaging and manifesto, which Mas raised. And I think there were a couple points I was trying to make here. I think that many voters don't really know the manifesto. There's so much out there. There's so much noise. It's political noise, right? That they don't even know what the programs are, and there's a new program every day, a new announcement every day. This is that. It's confusing, right? I mean, most people don't have time to absorb things. They're not like you, Mas, who follows the media every day and reads all these other things. In that context, that's your job, right? But for most people, it's just like it's politics, it's noise, and they've tuned off. They've tuned off also from the scandals, right? They've reached a saturation point on these types of areas, right? So in that context, the key things, and I think there's some very interesting elements of the manifesto, but the problem is that connecting it, right, and getting past all this noise and allowing people to hear, and I think it's not just the message and the messaging. It's also it's about prioritizing messages, right? And finding ways of communicating it. And I think a lot of these same individuals are in multiple roles, so there isn't that same connectivity on these questions. And there's not enough engagement with civil society in these areas also as well, from the perspective of the women's side of things, because there's so much going on. Electoral reform, environmental movements, which is exciting, but it's also part of that particular area. Now, in terms of corruption, I couldn't agree with you more. The women's issues are real, the things that are accessible. But I think the men's issues are also real, but they haven't necessarily been translated now in that way. And I think what will be interesting to see is how that plays out in the campaign. But I think what is very important to recognize is that many people don't the corruption is something that they don't see, they don't feel. You see, even though I'm talking not about urban people, they see it all the time. I'm talking about some people in the rural areas. And in fact, for them, corruption is actually, the giving of money is not really corruption. So it has different types of meanings in some places. And so it's a bit more complicated than just saying it's an abusive system, which for some people it's a no-brainer. I think I've answered some of these questions. Okay. Last but not least, we have two more. Okay, go ahead. Yes.
Shanti and you, and then George, do you want to continue your graduate?
Could we have it offline because
Offline.
Okay. All right. Yes. Okay. Yes.
Because it's streaming, right?
My
Because
question
they're streaming
is
live.
not to do with the Malaysian electorate, but with the expatriate community in this country, those who are here to do business, Europeans and others. I've spoken to some of them, and their point of view is that, relatively speaking, in comparison with other countries in the region, the incumbent government hasn't done too badly at all. Growth rate is not too bad. They gave a few indicators, they can still do that business. Why do you want to change? Dream about a change. How do people think that? So if the expatriate community is thinking that, I'm wondering about the Malaysians themselves. Do they also feel, is there a sizable sector of the population that feels, relatively speaking, we are not doing too badly in this country?
Let's do a quick survey now.
I think this is not a good sample, all right?
Because you're not my friend if you don't change it.
There's a question here. What about Indian women representation from the opposition parties? What are the dynamics of that? Because we don't see Indian women in opposition as well. So I'm just wondering.
We see some. History is going to be in Bugakase as an example, right? So we have some. We have at least one I can point to, which is not what I'm pointing to the other side in that context. I think there are going to be more than one, from what I can tell. But I was able to get a sense of some of the numbers. I'm not sure what the actual details are going to be in terms of that. But I think there is a recognition. The numbers are increasing for women in opposition, and they're not increasing on the BN side. That's a big shift and change in terms of candidates that they're going to select. Okay. And you're seeing that, for example, in Sabah and Sarawak, the increase in number of women that the opposition has slated is quite significant compared to the past. And that's been a big change in 2011 election, 2006 election in Sarawak. We've seen that we're going to see more women slated in Sabah this time around. So I think there's shifts that are happening from those numbers. Now, for my answer to the issue about the question about expat community, I think it's a bit ironic. My parents were here, and that's how I came to Malaysia as an expat many years ago. But frankly, they don't matter. I mean, what really matters is that, I'm going to come to your question in a moment, but I just want to point out is what they think doesn't matter. What really matters in the election is what Malaysians think. Now, what do Malaysians think? I do feel that there is a sense of people who do feel that Haji Tun Razak has done a good job. And he is popular. All right. I mean, he is liked. But the survey data shows this. All right. I mean, but that may not necessarily translate into voting in one way or the other. But one has to recognize that people say that they perceive him that way. I mean, a segment of the population sees him that way. And I think that when we look at the data and we look at, and I talk to people. I mean, and one of the things of being non-Malaysian here is I get different answers because I'm they'll tell me things that they'll say, oh yeah, I like him. I speak even in Singapore. I'm talking to Malaysians all the time because they're working in Singapore, right? The Johorians come across and you say, so who are you going to vote for? Every Malaysian I ask the crazy people, who are you going to vote for? Why? If you're registered, why you're not registered, and they like, what do you think of Najib? Oh, he's not so bad, or oh, I can't stand the guy. I mean, you get the diversity. And the polling data shows that. I mean, people are split. The Malay community is also a decisive issue in the campaign because the Malay community is split. And so this difference of few votes here and few votes there, right, will be very important politically. So to answer your question is, you do have people who believe that this in a strong base. But I think the general trend, however, has been, and I think this is why this contest is so important. The trend is that the BN safe seats are less safe than they were before. And I think that the trend has been, and this is something that is actually why this contest is important from a perspective of higher competition, is that the seats that were traditionally their bread and butter seats, the mixed seats, which they put so much emphasis in the 1980s and others, are no longer as secure as they were before. And why states like Johor and even parts of Pahang and other parts are so competitive politically is because they are mixed seats, which make them more competitive. I think I'll close there, if you don't mind. I forecast that the Malaysian people will decide the election.